Welcome to this final day of the Intermedia Conference. It's a real privilege, it's a pleasure to have with us Jan-Louis Kruger for this second keynote. Jan-Louis is head of the Department of Linguistics at Macquarie University in Sydney. And for many years now, he's done tremendous research on audiovisual translation, cognitive load, multimodal processing. This is, I believe, kind of the overview that he's going to be presenting today. So the floor is yours, and thank you very much, Jan-Louis.
Thank you, Pablo. Okay. I'm going to have to start with a disclaimer. I lied to you, and of course you knew this. We can't look into the minds of audiences, and that we're a long way off from actually being able to do that. But it's a testament to the willing suspension of disbelief that you all pitched up for this. So let's see. Then secondly, I also have to say that I'm sometimes going to stick more closely to my slides than the organizers advised. And as my good friend Anya Jankowska pointed out yesterday, I used to suck at this, but I've improved. After 20 years, I'm finally beginning to get it right. So let's hope today won't disappoint. So our starting point here is that film is, of course, dynamic and it is multimodal, and we all know this. It's not always that easy, however, for us to bear that in mind when we look at the practice of audiovisual translation. We know the audience is there, but we don't necessarily take into account the impact of the multimodality and the dynamic nature of the text that they have to deal with on a moment-to-moment basis into account. Because of this nature of audiovisual translation and film, viewers have to process various channels of information at the same time, and they have to integrate that continuously. So where do audiences look and where do they listen? And these are important questions. And how does this matter? How does this matter to the field of audiovisual translation? Audiovisual translation is, of course, all about access. If we look at subtitling, audio description, dubbing, voiceover, all of these provide access to a multimodal text and contexts to everyone who's excluded from full or optimal access for any reason, such as physical, circumstantial, or linguistic. My focus will mainly be on subtitling, and I'll look at subtitles as part of such a multimodal text and product and context. The questions I'll be looking at include: how do we process the multimodality of audiovisual translation? In other words, what information do we get where? How do we deal with competition and redundancy between the various sources of information? And then also, how do we prioritize certain sources of information over others, and why? Why do we select the ones that we do? And is there a pattern in this? Do all viewers do the same thing, or is this wholly individual? To do this, I'm going to give a short overview of some of the methodologies that have been used over the years. I'll look at some of the main findings, main shortcomings, main strengths, but also I'll try to give a few stabs at the way forward, at where I believe we should be going. Of course, we know that visual perception is limited. Sighted viewers can only see a very small window at any given time in detail, in enough detail to extract meaningful information. And this is an illusion that the brain creates. When you look around, you have the impression that you can see everything in perfect detail. But it's only really in that very small area where you're focusing, where your fixation lands, that you can actually extract detailed information. But the brain, of course, takes all of these little snapshots and then puts it all together so that you have this impression that you can see everything clearly in front of you. To make sense of film, like of reality, you have to therefore shift your attention continuously between the different sources of visual saliency, but also the different sources or the different information that your brain tells you you need to look at in order to understand what you're looking at. So what do we know about these eye movements? Foveal vision refers to the fact that we, as I said, see a very small area of the visual field in focus. And part of the illusion is created that we can see everything clearly is created by the fact that we have peripheral vision. So peripheral vision can alert your brain to the fact that there is more to the visual scene than just where you're looking, but you can't see a lot of detail there. There are different cues in that, in the peripheral vision that then draw your attention to the relevant areas. So anything like movement or contrast will work very well. And the brain has been programmed for this. It's really good at picking up movement, because if there's something, if there's a saber-toothed tiger coming from the side, then you need to react very quickly. So it's based on that very primal element of human cognition. So let's do a little exercise to see how this works. If you focus just on the first word of that sentence, then and you stop yourself from looking at the rest, you can see that there's text to the right of it, but you can't actually extract any detailed information about that. The only way for you to read that is to make saccades between the different fixations and to shift your gaze. And if you start out on the how, for example, you can see that there's more complicated word following, that there's a longer word following, and you can start extracting information. Your brain, very much like in speech recognition, works on models on predictive reading. So you know after a certain number of words, the list of possible words that will follow is shorter. So that's how we process, and that's also why we very often skip about 1/3 of the words in any text that you read, because you can deduce. But then you also have a perceptual span, which goes about 2 to 3 characters to the left of where you're fixating, and about 8, 9 characters to the right. Unless you read in a right-to-left language, then it just inverts, even when you read both languages, depending on which direction you're reading. So it looks a little bit like that. This is not perfect, but that's the idea, that as you shift your gaze, a different part comes into focus. And there are experiments in psychology where they use a moving window paradigm, where anything that you look at comes into focus, and everything around that then is blurred out. And if you do that in the text, in other words, automatically, as you shift your gaze, whatever you're looking at comes into focus, and the rest of the text is obscured. In experiments like that, the reader of such a text is not aware of the fact that the rest of the text is blurred. You have the illusion you can see everything clearly. When we watch video and subtitled video, then very much the same thing happens. Pablo will be talking later on about subtitle blindness, which is very much related to this. And then Gabriela Flies, Adam Zikorski, and Agnieszka Zarkowska will be talking about the dubbing effect, which also has something to do with where people attend. But if you look at subtitled film like this, then if you're looking at the kangaroo, you can see that there's text at the bottom of the screen, but you can't read that text while you're looking at the image. You have to shift your gaze down to the text. And once you're looking down at the text, you can't make out details on facial expressions or anything like that, detailed information in the image itself. So reading and scene perception in subtitled film cannot happen simultaneously. You have to choose. We do this very efficiently and very quickly, which means that we have this impression that we can process everything. But this does become important in the practice of subtitling. So we're just going to take a look at some eye tracking data to give us a better idea of how this visual attention works. And I'll try.
Your head needs trimming.
This is 2 people, the scan plot of 2 people looking at that
I don't
scene.
care where you are, as long as you're ready.
So as you can see in this scene, it's a very complex visual scene. It's from Sherlock Holmes' Game of Shadows. And Holmes is hiding in his apartment, and Watson is looking everywhere to try and find him. The viewer is drawn into that. You also, part of that, you're trying to identify where he is. So you're constantly trying to find cues for where Holmes might be. So you see the dummy in the window, for example, and everybody looks at that because there's contrast.
I'm not going to play this game. Remember, I have to catch the last train.
And again, there are very specific things that you look at. Facial features you're going to look at. anything that's in the center of the screen, and that's of course done deliberately by the filmmaker, anything in the center of the screen will draw your attention. If something moves, like there's a bird, you saw the bird. And all of these things are designed very cleverly to draw your attention to different things and to hide certain things from you because of your perceptual blindness. Now, if we look at it in a slightly different way,
Your hedge needs trimming.
that's a heat map. You can see that the viewers, because this is the data from a number of viewers,
I don't care where you are, as long as you're ready.
and you can see that there are similar patterns for how viewers look at this particular scene.
I'm not going to play this game. Remember, I have to catch the last train.
Okay, and then I'm going to go to the focus map, which is just another visualization of the same scene.
Your hedge needs trimming. I don't care where you are, as long as you're ready.
This gives us a very good visualization of what's visible to the viewer.
I'm not going to play this game. Remember, I have to catch the last train.
That's you, Dad, I'm afraid.
You win. I lose. Game over.
Still don't see me.
And right at the end, you see Holmes stepping out in bookcase camouflage into the scene. So in all of these visualizations, we get an idea of how viewers then shift their attention between the pertinent elements in the scene, what they need to try and figure out where Holmes is, but then also still attending to the text and shifting their gaze. So if we turn to the cognitive processing of subtitles, we have quite a lot of research already on the processing of subtitles. And this consists of research that focus on performance measures, on subjective post-hoc measures, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail now, but also online measures like eye tracking and a little bit of EEG as well. But it's really in combining all of these, triangulating the data we get from the performance, subjective and physiological measures that we start to get a better image or a better idea of how people process audiovisual texts. Post-hoc measures, in terms of that, there's quite a tradition spanning more than 20 years where people have shown that subtitles are beneficial. Subtitles improve things like word recognition, comprehension, because of the fact that, Burden-Williams says, because of the fact that it allows integration of reading and listening skills. Van der Planck says they increase comprehension because the subtitles neutralize accents and dialects, so they disambiguate. Markham in 1999 found that subtitles have listening benefits, and specifically in terms of word recognition also. So there's a lot of performance data on the benefits of subtitles. However, these earlier studies focus really only on paper-based unidimensional measures that are done after the test. So it really relies on memory as much as anything else. And most importantly, they lack identifiable links between specific features of the subtitles and benefits in cognition or benefits in comprehension. We don't know what element in the subtitle made a difference. We just know that in general something in subtitles works, and something in subtitles will stimulate memory and comprehension, assist comprehension. Subjective post-hoc measures, there's been a lot of work there on cognitive load, which is really about post-hoc self-rating of cognitive effort. In educational psychology, there's quite a lot of work on that, that essentially just tests the perception that the viewer has of the effort they expended in doing a particular task or in looking at a certain scene. So if we have one version with subtitles, the other without, and we ask people about the amount of effort, and you have a large enough population then, or sample, you can actually get an idea of the impact it had on comprehension, but again, not linked to specific measures or features. In immersion, we really look at that extent to which the viewer forget about their surroundings and enter into fictional reality. And there are a number of measures there in media psychology with things like transportation. Louise's works a lot on presence, engagement, absorption, different terms referring to similar things. In online measures, we've done quite a lot of work in the audiovisual translation community on using eye tracking, and also a little bit of work integrating eye tracking and EEG. My focus will, of course, be mainly on eye tracking. So what is it about eye tracking that makes it useful? Eye tracking gives us an indirect measure of what people are processing. If you know what somebody's looking at, there's a good chance that that's linked to what they're thinking about, what they're attending to cognitively. And sometimes the eye position is also under cognitive control, but not always, because there are bottom-up elements like movement, contrast, where your eye is drawn to something and you didn't necessarily control that movement because it's just a reaction, an automatic reaction. When we look at subtitle reading, then we, of course, also have to take into account that reading subtitles is different from reading a static text. The text is presented at a rate that's not under the control of the reader. And also there's split attention. So these are all important factors. Some of the primary eye tracking measures that we use include fixations, which is just that moment that the eye is relatively still and that it can extract information. It's also called a visual intake event, because it's at that moment that you can extract information. When your eye's busy moving, you don't extract information. It's like the brain just shutters for that moment until you get to the next point of fixation, and then you can obtain more information. Saccades, however, can also tell us a lot, the number of saccades, the length of saccades, and this is often linked to that perceptual span, that how much you can see while you're looking at one point, and then how far your eyes have to be programmed to travel to the next point in order to be able to complete the whole picture. Regressions can tell us a lot as well, because that's simply when somebody gets stuck on something, they'll go back. They'll go past it and then go back and try and reinterpret it. If there's been an ambiguity, they'll come back to disambiguate, something like that. So regressions tell us a lot in reading as well. Pupil dilation can give us a good indication of effort, but it's a fraught measure. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. Secondary eye tracking measures include things like gaze time, so the amount of visual attention a particular area of interest receives, the time, the latency, the time to the first fixation. For example, after the subtitle appears, how long does it take the viewer to get to the subtitle? And then how is that impacted by the complexity of the visual scene, are things that we look at. The number of glances or revisits, shifting between subtitle and image, for example. The number of skipped subtitles, how that's impacted by different factors. And then things like word fixation probability, how many fixations are there per word in a particular stretch of text. But these are all relatively global measures. In EEG, there have been some studies on using EEG, but I personally am not a big fan of that because I don't quite understand it, I think, but also because it's really, really messy. You get loads and loads of data, and you have to average a tremendous amount. There are many filters that you use, but okay, let me get back to the measures themselves. What we've looked at is, for immersion, is beta coherence, which essentially is just the coherence in the cortical activity or in the brain activity between the prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex. And the prefrontal is linked more to cortical executive processing, and the posterior parietal cortex linked to the imagination. So if those two areas are coherent, then it means that you're more in control of your emotions. So if there's less coherence, it means that you're more involved. So that's the narrative behind that one. So when we calculate that then and we get less coherence, we can say that that indicates that there's more immersion or more empathy in that particular moment. Alpha and theta power, on the other hand, give us an indication of cognitive effort. And they are fairly robust, but again, really tricky to work with. This is just an indication of some of the things that have to be done to eye tracking data. There's a lot of filtering going on. You have to use a lot of missed data. Eye blinks cause artifacts that you have to filter out. And then you have to bin your data. So it's really, really messy, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's not something that you should do unless you have a neurologist or somebody in neuroscience involved in the study. Multimodal redundancy, of course, is not something that phases viewers. Viewers can process multimodal redundancy with astonishing efficiency. And this struck me again when I saw the infamous voiceover practices in Poland, which for somebody who's not used to it looks mind-boggling. It's very difficult to see how you can actually immerse yourself in something like that. But then it's really about what you get used to and how you start processing signals. What cues do you pick up from that little bit of the original soundtrack that's available before the voiceover kicks in? And you're not getting any content information necessarily, but it gives you cues on how you have to interpret whatever will be said in the voiceover. So when you have information in more than one source, however, you inevitably start checking and comparing. And that's why we pick up errors in subtitles or captions quite easily, because not only because you can see it doesn't belong there, but also because there's a mismatch between two of the sources of information. And if you look at the setup that we have here, I mean, there's so many redundant sources of information here. I told Pablo, it's so accessible, it becomes inaccessible because there's just so much. You can't possibly process all of these sources at the same time. You have to select. But then it also means that you can shift between different sources and compare them. So in terms of audiovisual translation, we engage with the multimodal text and we integrate all of these sources of information, but it also means that we have to continually prioritize sources of information. We have to decide which of these sources take priority, which of these sources will give us the most stable source of information that we can use to construct our understanding of the scene as a whole. And this is because film is dynamic. It keeps changing. When we look at multiple sources of information, you can see how viewers shift their attention between all the sources that they think might give them some information. Faces, hands, hand gestures, even if it's meaningless hand gestures like I'm making here, you will be drawn to that and try and get information there. The text, of course, in subtitles, and then if there are slides, and this is very much like what we have here. Visual competition, you can see how viewers switch between the different sources. If you have a talking head video with subtitles, you'll switch between the eyes, the expressions, the lips of the speaker, and the text. You'll also attend to visually salient elements. Not everything is equally salient, and you'll try to figure out what is important, but you'll also be drawn to the visually salient, the things that stand out. And then when we deal with more complex texts, the processing difficulty increases, because then you have to integrate what you hear in order to what you hear and what's in the subtitles with what's in something like a graph, where you have to use that to interpret the graph and to understand the graph. And you can see how the viewer there, yellow is not the best color here, but you can see how the viewer listens to the text or read the text and then tries to find those coordinates on the graph. And in order to do all of this, we, as readers, as viewers, develop very sophisticated visual routines. And there's a lot of work on in modeling of eye movement behavior in reading, for example, that explore these routines, how people decide to prioritize certain sources of information? How do you, you don't read 2 words and then look at the image and then come back and find where you were and carry on. You typically chunk that in different sections, or you try to get the context and then use that to read. Am I still going okay? Yeah. Okay, so when we look at the speed of presentation of subtitles, presentation speed, there's a very clear impact of presentation speed on how we process. If you have a lot of time, you can see most viewers can get to all of the text in that scene, and they can also see a lot of the scene. When you speed it up, most of the viewers only get to the first part of the sentence before it disappears, and they also don't have enough time to look at the rest of the scene. If we look at some of the EEG data, we've used this to establish that the subtitled version results in more immersion consistently, but also that this varies across scenes. This is from the same Sherlock Holmes opening 30 minutes. As the scene changes, the levels of immersion fluctuate. And that's quite promising. The same thing happens with the cognitive effort, that you can see differences in cognitive effort based on the mode. And we found consistently higher cognitive load with subtitles, but more immersion and more comprehension, in other words, also. Whereas with integrated titles, we found that the cognitive load there is lower because the titles are placed where people would be looking, so it's integrated with the scene better. So there's less effort required to actually process those subtitles. We've also tried to validate theta power, specifically by looking at linguistically simple text, just talking head paradigm, and linguistically complex texts, and seeing what happens with theta power in that. And we then triangulated that with learning comprehension measures and also self-rated cognitive load. I'm not going to go into that. So eye tracking in earlier studies have focused primarily on attention distribution between subtitle and image, on global measures, if comparing the eye movements across all of the subtitles in a clip, for example, and also subtitle processing, so degree of processing, efficiency of processing. Agnieszka has done a lot of that as well. In more recent studies, we're beginning to look at more word-level measures, trying to see what happens to individual words. How does word frequency, for example, if you have a very common low-frequency or high-frequency word, how is that processed when you compete for attention with other visual information? In subtitling viewing, we've used eye tracking in the past to look at attention distribution, as I've said, at the impact of translation strategies on subtitle reading, the impact of shot changes, text segmentation, placement and presentation speed, and cognitive processing. So a host of studies have been done in this area already. If we return to presentation speed, however, and I sense this might still look a little bit incoherent, but just to indicate to you how complicated this is, presentation speed is not just a fixed entity. It varies very much across a particular scene. And what we had here was very verbatim subtitles and edited subtitles, and verbatim subtitles, you can see the yellow spikes are much higher. Some of those subtitles edge about 40 characters per second. And that, of course, poses problems. In the PhD by Gordon Matthew, we found that verbatim subtitles are more likely to be skipped. They are also more likely to be skipped in the presence of visually redundant information, and they induce higher cognitive load, longer fixations, and also fewer fixations. Back to the presentation speed study, we can see in this visualization also how at 12 characters per second, the viewer can very easily get to all of the text and also go back to lower frequency words like saliva. But when you speed it up, the viewers don't get past that low frequency word. They get stuck on that low frequency word. The global and local measures that we're looking at map onto the ones that I've spoken about earlier. But here we look at word frequency and word length effects, and we see how word skipping regressions to individual words, first fixation durations on particular words, low frequency or long words, and gaze durations and viewing time change. We saw in that experiment where we manipulated the presentation speed of subtitles, and I presented on this in Stockholm as well, that comprehension is benefited by the presence of video. So if you only have the subtitles, people won't understand as well as when you have the contextualizing information of video. But as the speed increases, with and without subtitles, that comprehension starts to decline. We see that the number of fixations start dropping. So as it speeds up, people have fewer, shorter fixations. They start skipping more, and they spend less time reading. But we also see that when the speed increases, reading of subtitles with and without video start looking almost exactly the same, which shows us that the viewer then starts shifting all of their attention to the subtitling in order to try to keep up. And I've said most of that already, so I'll skip that. So subtitles as dynamic text confronts viewers with very short segments of text that's semi-transient. It's only there for a limited time period, and it competes for attention with other sources of information. What this does is it introduces different levels of redundancy between the spoken text and dialogue, and also between the subtitle text and the image. And these redundant sources of information may be beneficial or detrimental. And I think you get a good sense of that in this particular setup. Sometimes it supplements, but sometimes you get so distracted by trying to compare what you see in one source versus the other that you kind of lose the content. The human mind, however, is immensely adaptable, and this ensures that we can process things cognitively very effectively in multimodal texts. What we need to understand better, however, is how people prioritize these different sources. So we need more studies on how audiovisual translation mediates these multimodal texts, and especially how we sequentially award attention to different elements. And in conclusion then, we can say that even though we really can't look into the minds of audiences, we can get a very good idea by looking at what people are looking at, asking them questions about what they looked at, about what they understood, and measuring certain physiological elements. We can get an idea of their cognitive processing. We can never quite get into that, but if you have robust experimental design, you can get an idea of how these things are processed. So where do we go to now? We still know very little about things like why viewers prioritize certain sources of information, whether this is consistent across larger samples, or whether this is wholly individual. We haven't begun to really investigate how sound and language impact on subtitle reading. There have been some studies, but we don't understand it because it's such a complex environment. It's so difficult to control your variables when you mix all of these things to get robust findings. We also need to know more about how visual routines change in relation to changes in the complexity of the image, the levels of overlap between the image, the subtitle, and the soundtrack, and how these things change. These things are slowly beginning to fall into place, but there is still a wide open field, and I think we'll get a little bit more in the next two presentations on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis. It's a really comprehensive overview of where we've been, where we are, and where we can go now in this area. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. Let me just check the time. Yes, we do. We have about 10 minutes for a bit less for questions. Would anybody? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Jean-François.
Speaking as a practitioner, as a professional translator, I'm Jean-François Cornu. I was pleased to see that in one of your many slides that the 12 characters per second seems to be scientifically confirmed It's an empirical rule that's been applied since the beginning of subtitling, almost 80 years ago. And it just goes to show that empirical rules and intuition are not such a bad thing after all. I would like to ask you to what extent your research involves professional translators and directors of photography, because what you showed with the Sherlock Holmes clip is very interesting, because initially it was created by a director of photography, with the filmmaker, of course. So they already have an idea of the directors of photography. They already have an idea of what people are going to look at within the frame. They obviously know that they won't perceive everything that's in a shot, especially if it's a very short shot. So I would like to know whether you have or you're planning to talk to directors of photography. And one last thing, to what extent do you take into account the relationship between sound, that is speech, anything that's on the soundtrack, and the perception of a subtitle? For example, in my, I can't remember exactly in what film or program I did that, but I clearly remember shortening a subtitle by a few frames so that it wouldn't clash with a loud sound or something unexpected for orally. Even if it means making the translation a little bit more different and perhaps not as perfect as one would have expected if I could have used those 3 or 4 frames extra, but so that the viewer is not disturbed by the sudden sound.
Yeah, and thank you for those questions. I might not get to everything. I think just very quickly to get that out of the way in terms of talking to filmmakers, Pablo's been doing a lot of that. There have been studies by people like Tim Smith looking at specifically how editing is processed by viewers. So that's pretty straightforward, I think, and yes, definitely important. And a lot of that is, we know that filmmakers do things in a very conscious way, and eye tracking research can help us confirm the effect of that, and it can also show how some of those things might not work or could be improved. In terms of the 12 seconds, I'm reluctant to use that.
12 characters.
I mean, 12 characters per second. I'm reluctant to use that to say this confirms that we have to go 12 characters per second. What it does show is that people, if you're at 12 characters per second, people can process text almost like they would process static text. So you have enough time to process everything. So doubtlessly, that works very well. It doesn't say you can't use higher speeds, because even at 20 characters per second, we still see that there's a lot of effective processing going on. But
perhaps,
we do see...
I've got the mic. Perhaps you could go back to the slide, actually. I think it would be great if we could have a look at this.
And remember, this is only one
The one on comprehension that you had.
Oh, the one on comprehension. No, that was further down, was it?
That was further down, yeah. This
There.
one.
Yeah.
So, if I may, on this topic, since I got hold of the mic, I just want us to have a look at this, because it's quite interesting how, looking at this hard data, we interpreted it totally differently. From Jean-Francois, have a look. Comprehension with the video, that's the orange one, 12 characters per second, is almost exactly the same as 20 characters per second. It's flat. There is no difference there. So you can't really say that 12 characters per second had a higher comprehension than 20. Where you do see the difference is the 28 characters per second, which is a crazy speed, right? So I want everybody to see this, actually, right? And I don't think this data shows this in particular. And if you go back to the previous slide, the one with edited and verbatim, the one that you said is quite messy, this one.
This one.
Yeah. So if you have a look, verbatim has a lower reading speed than edited, which is quite interesting. 13, 14, it doesn't really...
Well, there's no difference there, really. It's
there's no
the
difference here, really. And I think, because I read this PhD and I looked at the clips, and what we have here as verbatim is actually automatic captions. This is not professionally done verbatim subtitling, if there is such a thing. But these are automatic captions that, and I've seen them, they're terribly segmented. They're not actually synchronized with the dialogue. So I think any results that you have from here may not stem from the fact that these subtitles were verbatim, but from the fact that they were just done very badly by a machine.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that all of that, and that came out in the discussion of that PhD as well. Please don't use this to say I say verbatim is good, edited is bad, or the other way around, or that we have to go 12 characters per second. What I'm saying is there is evidence that something happens at these different speeds. We don't understand that well enough yet. We have to do this not in short video clips of 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. We have to do it in long video clips so that you see what happens also over time. Do we get cognitive overload if you have a long clip that you expose people to? We also have to be attuned to the fact that we can't look at average speeds in subtitles in any case, because you will have many subtitles that are really very fast and some that are really very slow. And there are other factors that impact. You can have a subtitle presented at 12 characters per second, but there's a lot of very complex information on screen, and you can't process the subtitle. Or you can have one at 20 characters per second, and there's nothing really on screen, and you can process it easily. So this is a complex thing to study, and there's a lot of work that we need to do there. The last question was about sound. And yes, definitely, these things have an impact, and this is a lot of the work that is being done. Pablo and I have also started talking about the possibility of looking at experimentally manipulating the onset of the subtitle to see how much delay you get, or after how much delay do you start getting a negative impact on comprehension. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So anybody who is just embarking on eye tracking research, the field is wide open.
We have maybe 1 minute for another question. Carol, if you can get a microphone at the top. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. That was fascinating and daunting in some ways. I was wondering about, you said that very little had been done on sound. So am I right in saying that little's been done on how viewers experience partial subtitling? So when some lines of dialogue are subtitled and some aren't, has there been any work done on that?
I'm not aware of any studies that have been done specifically on that. Maybe tangentially, but not intentionally or specifically. But definitely yes, because it goes back to the idea of visual routines, and this also goes back again to the inconsistent speed of subtitles. We start processing, it doesn't matter how complicated an audiovisual text is, we develop ways to deal with that, and we develop visual routines to cope with it. It's when these things keep shifting that I think it becomes very challenging, because you just, as you get used to one mode, you expect the subtitle to be there, then suddenly there isn't one. And then your eye will be looking at where it is. And Pablo, you've found in some of the subtitles appearing in blocks that people spend a great deal of time looking at where the subtitle is about to appear. Nothing is there yet, but they know something's going to come in word for word and scrolling, yeah. So that clearly indicates that we adjust our visual behavior to cope with something like that. And then it's just about what happens when you encounter something you didn't expect. And the same thing happens when you encounter a low-frequency word. You can process things fairly automatically. Eye movements are tremendously efficient until you hit a snag, until there's a garden path or there's something that you didn't expect, and then you get stuck. And it's exactly, again, like in interpreting. When you're doing simultaneous interpreting and you encounter a hurdle somewhere, then you get stuck there, and then the whole system starts falling over.
Thank you.
One very last question, Luis, Agnieszka, is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah,
Can I ask how you measure comprehension? Because I think it's not necessary that everybody has to understand 100%.
Yeah.
I think people are satisfied with understanding maybe.
Yeah, and that's another caution with the interpretation of the comprehension data we had there. If you want to measure comprehension, then it becomes incredibly complicated. We spoke about this yesterday as well. It's what are you measuring? Are you measuring insight? Are you measuring short-term memory? What is it that you're measuring? So I think that that's an area where we still need to do a lot of work here for the triangulation, because we can very easily jump to conclusions based on comprehension results without really having a robust understanding of what it is we measured. Comprehension tests have to be validated like any other test. And I don't think we necessarily, it's very often, and I know I've been guilty of it, my students have been guilty of it. You design an experiment and you know there has to be comprehension questions, and it's the last minute thing. You do it right at the end, and then you start your experiment, you've already collected 10 sets of data, and you realize there's a problem with the questions, but you can't change it because then you have to chuck all of that out. But I agree with you. I can't tell you that we've done a very robust one. It was fairly short multiple choice questions. In some of the other studies that my PhD students are doing now, we're combining that with people doing free recall. We try to gauge how much they understood by asking them to explain what the text was about in their own words. But that's really difficult to code then and to analyze. But yes, no, we need to do more about that.
We're being told off already, so I think we need to finish here. So thank you very much, Jean-Louis, again, for this brilliant presentation and for all your questions as well.